Marissa Lane had always been the kind of woman who noticed things others didn't. She noticed when numbers didn't add up in the school budget, when promises were made that never materialized, and when the town council's decisions seemed to favor a select few over the community as a whole. For years, she had tried to speak up quietly, attending meetings, submitting reports, and asking questions in ways that wouldn't make her a target. But the more she noticed, the clearer it became. The corruption ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit, and silence had allowed it to grow. Marissa taught history at the local high school, and her students admired her for her honesty and courage. She often reminded them that truth was not always easy, but it was necessary. She lived in a modest home at the edge of town, a small house she had inherited from her grandmother. It wasn't much, but it was hers, filled with memories of family dinners, laughter, and the quiet comfort of a life built on integrity. And it was exactly that integrity that had made her a target. It began subtly. Anonymous letters slipped under her door, warning her to stop asking questions. She dismissed them at first, chalking them up to idle threats, the work of someone trying to scare her off. But then her tires were slashed, her mailbox destroyed, and a shadow lingered too long outside her window at night. Her friends urged her to be careful, some even suggesting she stop her inquiries altogether. But Marissa refused. She knew the truth was bigger than her fear. She knew that silence was a luxury she could not afford, not when the people she cared about were at risk from those hiding behind power and money. Then came the night that changed everything. The wind howled through the streets, rattling windows and bending the trees outside her home. Marissa had stayed late at the school, finishing up grading papers, when she heard it, the faint crackle of flames, almost imperceptible at first. Then the smell of smoke. Panic surged through her as she raced down the hall, grabbing her daughter, Lily, who was sleeping peacefully in her crib. The fire had already taken hold in the living room, spreading with a speed that seemed unnatural, devouring everything in its path. The fire department arrived too late to save much. Neighbors watched from the safety of their yards, whispering, some in fear, some in pity, as flames consumed the home they had known Marissa to love. She held Lily close, her heart pounding not just with fear, but with anger. This wasn't just an accident, it was a message. The people who wanted her silenced had made sure she would understand that courage had a price. In the aftermath, the town's reaction was mixed. Some were sympathetic, offering clothes, food, and temporary shelter. Others avoided her, wary of being associated with someone who had dared to challenge the powers that be. The police investigated, but the evidence pointed too clearly to arson, and the trail seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. Marissa refused to be cowed. She documented everything she remembered, every suspicious encounter, every note, every shadow that had lingered too long. She refused to give her attackers the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Friends and colleagues tried to console her, reminding her that the battle had already taken its toll, that she needed to retreat and heal. But Marissa's spirit was unshakable. Even as she slept in a borrowed bedroom, surrounded by boxes of clothes and keepsakes that had survived the blaze, she made plans. She thought about the people behind the fire, about the lies they had tried to spread, about the injustice they believed would end her fight. They had underestimated her. They had assumed that fear would break her, but it only made her stronger, sharper, more determined. As weeks turned into months, Marissa began to piece together the next step. She realized that exposing the corruption was no longer just about sending reports to the local council or writing letters to the press. She needed a position from which she could protect herself and others, a role where she could investigate, confront, and bring accountability to those who believed themselves untouchable. In that role, she realized with a clarity that startled even her, was within the very system that had once seemed distant and unapproachable. But for now, she focused on surviving, on rebuilding her life one small piece at a time. She walked the streets of her town with renewed purpose, each step a declaration. She was not broken, she was not afraid, and the truth she carried could not be burned away. Every time she saw the charred remains of her home, she remembered that courage was forged in fire, and that fire had made her stronger than ever. After the fire, Marissa Lane's life changed in ways that were both painful and necessary. She had lost her home, the comfort of familiar walls and rooms filled with memory, and the sense of safety she had once taken for granted. But losing her home did not mean losing her purpose. On the contrary, it sharpened her resolve. She realized that her fight against corruption and injustice required more than courage. It required tools, resources, and authority she had never possessed as a civilian. The law she had once observed from the outside would now become her weapon, and the badge she would earn would become her shield. Marissa spent months rebuilding her life, finding a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It was modest, barely enough for her and Lily, but it was safe. She surrounded herself with the essentials, keeping little that could remind her of what she had lost in the fire. Her neighbors were kind but distant, respectful of her quiet strength and the tragedy she had endured. During the day, she volunteered at community centers and helped at the local school, keeping herself in motion, never idle, never allowing fear or grief to settle. At night, she studied law enforcement procedures, reading every manual she could find, watching every training video, and learning the inner workings of the system she intended to join. Her determination soon led her to the town's police recruitment office. She walked through its doors with the same unwavering courage she had carried into city council meetings and school board hearings. Here, she was no longer just a concerned citizen, she was a candidate for real authority, someone who could investigate, enforce, and protect. The officers who interviewed her noted the fire in her eyes, the clarity of purpose, the unwavering belief in justice. She spoke of accountability, of protecting the vulnerable, of ensuring that truth could never again be silenced by fear. By the end of the process, she was accepted into the academy, ready to take on the next stage of her journey. Training was grueling. Early mornings began before sunrise, and nights ended with exhaustion so deep it felt like her body would break. She ran drills, learned how to read crime scenes, practiced interrogation techniques, and mastered the legal codes that governed the very corruption she had once fought from the outside. But nothing could break her spirit. Every bead of sweat, every bruised shoulder, every aching muscle reminded her that she was preparing not just for a career, but for a mission to bring justice to those who had burned her home and to protect the truth that had survived that fire. Her first day on the force was a revelation. She walked the streets she had once feared, the same streets where she had once been a target, now as a protector. People stared, whispering as she passed, unsure whether she was a stranger or a familiar face transformed. Her presence alone became a statement. She had returned, stronger and more determined than ever. When she answered calls, she did so with an intensity that drew respect from veteran officers. She asked questions others overlooked, pursued leads that seemed dead, and investigated complaints that others dismissed. Slowly, her reputation grew. The people who had underestimated her, the very ones who had tried to intimidate her, began to realize that they were now the ones under scrutiny. But the most important transformation was internal. Marissa had learned to channel her fear, grief, and anger into focus. She had learned to control her emotions in the heat of confrontations, to weigh evidence with precision, and to act decisively when opportunity and justice aligned. She was no longer just a victim or a whistleblower, she was a guardian of truth, a force that could no longer be ignored. And the town itself began to change. Citizens noticed the new officer who asked hard questions, the officer who refused bribes or shortcuts, the officer who listened when people feared speaking up. Slowly, the culture of silence began to crack, and whispers of admiration replaced whispers of fear. One evening, as she drove home from a long shift, Marissa looked at the distant remains of her old home, still a burned-out shell. She did not feel sorrow this time. Instead, she felt power, a quiet, unstoppable power. The fire had tried to silence her, but it had done the opposite. It had forged her into someone who could fight not just for herself, but for anyone threatened by those who believed the truth could be buried. Her badge was more than a symbol, it was a promise that injustice would be met with courage, that fear would be met with action, and that lies would be met with truth. By the time Marissa Lane had completed her first year on the force, she had become a figure both respected and feared. Her reputation for relentless pursuit of justice spread beyond her precinct. She was known for asking the questions everyone else avoided, for following leads others had abandoned, and for refusing to let bureaucracy or politics stand in the way of truth. But her ultimate goal had always remained the same. The people who had burned her home and tried to silence her would be held accountable. Every step of her journey had led to this moment, and she knew she had to be meticulous. One mistake could allow them to slip away. She began by quietly gathering evidence, working long hours into the night, cross-referencing records, and tracking suspicious transactions. She pulled witness statements, compared timelines, and dug into communications that others had dismissed as irrelevant. The trail was labyrinthine, but Marissa had something her adversaries did not: determination born from personal loss, and a mind sharpened by months of intense training. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency was a thread that, when pulled, could unravel the entire network of corruption and intimidation. Marissa's first move was to secure insider testimony. She reached out to individuals within the town administration who had been coerced into silence, assuring them that she could protect them and that the law was finally on their side. Some were skeptical, afraid of retaliation, but Marissa's calm, unwavering presence inspired trust. Slowly, they began to open up, providing names, dates, and documents that painted a damning picture of the conspiracy against her. Each piece of evidence was carefully catalogued, each story meticulously recorded. She knew that to succeed, she had to anticipate every defense, every lie, every attempt at manipulation. As the investigation progressed, the perpetrators grew restless. They tried intimidation once more, leaving veiled threats on her patrol route, testing boundaries, hoping to provoke fear. But Marissa remained unshaken. Her presence on the streets, her active engagement with the community, and her unrelenting pursuit of leads sent a clear message: fear would no longer work. She had already survived fire, threats, and isolation. Now she wielded the authority and expertise to turn the tables. The culmination of her efforts came on a brisk autumn morning. She had collected enough evidence to coordinate arrests simultaneously, ensuring that none of the conspirators had the chance to warn one another. Officers were briefed, roles assigned, and timing synchronized down to the second. Marissa herself led the operation, walking into each scene with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what had to be done. The first door she knocked on opened to a man who had once thought he could destroy her life without consequence. He froze, recognition flashing in his eyes, as Marissa presented her credentials and recited the charges. One by one, the others were apprehended. Each arrest carried a symbolic weight beyond the legal ramifications. These were the people who had tried to snuff out a voice that spoke truth, who had thought that arson and intimidation could crush integrity. As they were led away in handcuffs, Marissa watched with a mixture of satisfaction and solemnity. Justice was not a spectacle for her, it was a restoration of balance, a reminder that no one was above the law. When the dust settled, Marissa returned to the precinct. Her colleagues congratulated her, but she remained focused. There was no triumphalism in her demeanor, only a deep, steady resolve. She visited her new home later that evening, her daughter asleep in the next room, and looked at the life she had rebuilt. The fire had tried to erase her past, but in its place, she had forged a new path, one defined not by loss, but by strength and purpose. She knew the town would never forget the courage it had witnessed, not just in her arrests, but in the months of preparation, planning, and unyielding determination that had led to this moment. Marissa Lane understood that the truth she fought for was bigger than her own story. It was about protecting the vulnerable, holding the powerful accountable, and ensuring that fear could never again silence justice. She walked the streets she had once feared with a renewed sense of ownership, her badge glinting in the streetlights like a beacon of resolve. The whispers that had once haunted her had transformed into murmurs of respect, and the community began to see what courage truly looked like. Even as the legal system processed the arrests and trials, Marissa continued her work with the same relentless energy. She knew that the fight against corruption was ongoing, and that vigilance was the price of justice. Yet she no longer carried fear in her heart, only a quiet, unshakable strength. The fire had destroyed her home, but it had forged a warrior. The threats had sought to silence her, but they had only amplified her voice. And as she tucked Lily into bed, she felt a profound certainty: the truth could be challenged, but it could never be extinguished. It rode back with her, strong, fearless, and unwavering, and the world would take notice.